Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 15th episode of Neurodiversity in a Nutshell. My name is Aryan, and today we have our latest guest, Sienna Castellon. Sienna Castellon is a United Kingdom-based 18-year-old neurodiversity advocate who is autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, and has ADHD. When she was 13 years old, Sienna created QOL Mentoring, a website that supports students with special educational needs. Most recently, Ms. Castellon launched Neurodiversity Celebration Week, an initiative which aims to encourage schools to flip the narrative from focusing on the challenges and drawbacks of being neurodivergent to focusing on strengths and talents. Earlier this year, over 850 schools and 870,000 individuals took part in Neurodiversity Celebration Week from across the United Kingdom and abroad. It's amazing to have you on our podcast today. So let's just get started by talking about Neurodiversity Celebration Week. How did this idea come to fruition on like an international level?
Yeah, so I started my QOL mentoring website when I was 13, and that was a website to just support and mentor students with learning differences. And I started getting lots of feedback from that, and people were telling me, I'm using your website and I'm trying to get help on my learning difference and have, an empowered viewpoint on it. But that's very difficult to do when my school isn't supporting me and my school isn't understanding me. And it became very clear that things needed to be done in the school sector. Teachers needed to be educated about neurodiversity and have to like change the way they talk about it. Because I've never had a teacher say anything positive about a neurodiversity. It's always, oh well, this is something that's wrong with you. And so I wanted to start Neurodiversity Celebration Week with three key aims: to educate teachers, to educate peers of neurodiverse individuals, and then to empower neurodiverse individuals and to flip the narrative, as you said, from focusing on the negatives to focusing on the positives. And I'm really happy because right now I have 880 schools subscribed and 580,000 students taking part, and it's really grown and it's having an impact, and I'm just really happy that I've been able to do that for people.
Yeah, so how can you ensure that like the effects of Neurodiversity Celebration Week last outside of the week as well?
Well, it's just that kind of mindset that I'm giving people and just the information that I'm giving people as well. Because, when I was at school, there was this idea that neurodiversity was reserved for people who were at the bottom of the class. And I was gifted and neurodiverse. And I found myself in a situation where, I was diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia, and I was going into school to get extra time for it. And teachers told me, we're not going to give you extra time because that's unfair. You're at the top of the class, and so it'll give you this unfair weighted advantage that means you're going to do so much better than everyone else. And we can't do that. And it was this fundamental misunderstanding in what extra time was for. It's not to give you an advantage above everyone else. It's to put you in the position you would be in if you didn't have your neurodiversity and help you achieve your potential. And that whole confusion stemmed from the fact that teachers thought that you couldn't be gifted and neurodiverse. But then through this week, you get to see Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Isaac Newton, all of whom had neurodiversities or have. And so from that, it only takes that one kind of moment to realize that when that just changes your viewpoint and that like reduces some of the stigma. And there's still going to be problems. So I'm not saying that Neurodiversity Celebration Week is like going to fix everything, but it definitely does change people's viewpoint and changes people's perspective, and people can bring that into the rest of the year.
Have you seen teachers and educators use some of the information and curriculum that you provide, um, you know, in actual syllabus and things like that across your schools that you've worked with?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of teachers really start using it more, and there are some schools where, they'll take Neurodiversity Celebration Week, very seriously, and they'll cancel lessons for that week, and they'll just spend the whole week doing activities from my website. And and there are definitely schools that aim to take some of those things I've mentioned in my week and then bring it and roll it out across the year. I mean, there are schools that are doing neurodiversity clubs and they're taking information from my website and rolling it out that way.
Yeah. So um, one of the other things that that you've probably talked about earlier or in like other interviews is your like autism research. And some of the things that you bring up are like UCL Center for Autism in Research and Education. Could you talk a little bit about your experiences there?
I had an amazing experience at UCL. A lot of the time, research that people do into autism doesn't help actually autistic people. Research, it revolves around how to cure autism, how to prevent it, what causes it, and that's not going to help someone like me. But research into how autism affects the brain, research into what teaching techniques work best for autistic people, research into how to reduce anxiety in autistic people. Those are all things that really help people who are autistic out there, and help, give advice, and can help shape the classroom in ways that an autistic person would appreciate. And so that's something that's very helpful. And CRE, the Center for Research in Autism Education at UCL, that's their focus. They do research that will help autistic people. And so when I was given the opportunity to work there, I was so happy about it. And I was so happy to be part of a project where that's important to them.
Yeah, so what exactly, what was your research specifically on, or like what did you help with specifically?
I did lots of work when I was there. One of the ones I really liked was they asked me to work on their disability service project. And so I worked trying to figure out, the best adjustments to put in place. And there was a lot of research that went into that because it was kind of figuring out what adjustments would work for different learning differences. And then even within certain differences, I mean, there are people who experience them in very different ways. So, there's some people who experience autism and like me, they're really, really sensitive to everything. And there are other people who can't feel lots of things. And so the way that those two people interact with the world means that they both need different adjustments. And, one's going to need to not be next to a fluorescent light bulb and in the back of the classroom, and someone's going to need to be at the very front. And so trying to figure out what works for everyone and having a kind of template guide was very helpful. And then I also, I gave a lot of different research suggestions. Um, Something that really needs to be done more is research into autism in girls and how that affects um, and that, because that's just not done. I did do a project on perceptual capacity, which is the amount of information you can take in from your environment, and that was a very interesting one, and it gave me some insight into just different research methods, and I helped out by just doing different cognitive assessments for that. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, so at UCL, you probably worked with many neurotypical individuals. So if you have any advice or like things that you noticed at UCL, do you have any like advice for neurotypical individuals to work along neurodivergent children, individuals, people in general?
I would just say be understanding and be supportive. The really great thing with UCL is I was kind of asked quite frequently, if there were any adjustments that I needed and anything that, would help me feel more comfortable in the space, and things like that. And there was something about that I really appreciated, because there are certain organizations where they may ask you once if there are any adjustments you might need, but there's a certain atmosphere where you feel like, okay, if I say I need these 5 things, they're going to categorize me as difficult. And so, I mean, there are times when I know exactly what I need. I know exactly what adjustments will help me, but I don't ask for them because I just don't feel comfortable in the environment. And Cray did a really good job in making sure that everyone knew that whatever adjustments they required, they would happily do, that there wouldn't be any problem, any categorizing anybody as difficult or problematic. And that was something I really appreciated.
Yeah, so I guess we can transition a little bit into some of the United Nations related things. You were recently selected as one of like the young leaders and ambassadors for the Sustainable Development Goals. Could you kind of discuss some of your goals and the opportunities that you've received through the SDG platform?
Yeah, so I've been really happy to be a part of the UN and to be a young leader for the SDGs. I've been given a few opportunities to talk about my experience, and to be on different panels, and especially give my perspective as a disabled young person. the UN is really trying to give a voice to more disabled communities and especially start to talk about the human rights impact of young people who are disabled. And so I'm doing that. I'm also on different, I got to meet the UN Secretary General, which was really awesome, virtually, but little opportunities like that, which are really great, and just to be able to talk about the work that I'm doing. And so, it's a relatively new opportunity. I'll be doing it for the next 2 years, and I hope to just be able to, raise a platform to the work I'm doing.
Yeah, so through the United Nations and Neurodiversity Celebration Week, you've kind of witnessed, I guess, two different approaches, like a top-bottom approach where, like the United Nations, is able to impact a lot of these smaller countries or these smaller organizations, or the like bottom-top approach with a lot of these schools and like on a smaller level. Which do you think is a little bit more effective in like promoting neurodiversity?
Um, I think it depends. I think that the way that I did my neurodiversity celebration week with going into schools was good, but it takes a long time to grow. Because the first time you do it, you don't really have much of a track record. I mean, I remember when I was convincing people to take part in this week, and the week had never been run before. And so people were like, okay, what is this going to look like? And then even I didn't really have answers for that, which I was like, this is what I want it to look like. I'm not sure that's going to actually happen. And then, and so that was like something that was difficult to get started. Whereas with the UN, it's already kind of gotten started. You just have to kind of join and continue your work. But once you get the smaller bottom up, like once you get that running, it can actually be very effective and it can have impact on, real people's lives. I mean, there are people who have done Neurodiversity Celebration Week and have contacted me afterwards and said that, it changed their perspective on their neurodiversity, improved their self-esteem and their mental health as a result. And so, but it's just the marketing and just getting it out there that's the barrier to that.
Yeah, so the United Nations obviously includes many countries, but one of the like main issues when it comes to a lot of disadvantaged and developing countries is that their levels of inclusion and their disability practices are often really falling behind. And there's steps to kind of reach that neurodiversity movement of creating a strengths-based model and things like that. What do you think is the best way to improve inclusive practices in a lot of these disadvantaged countries that may not have the ability to disseminate information as effectively, or build infrastructure that's actually available to neurodiverse individuals?
I mean, I think it's really important to include disabled people in the decision making process. I mean, that's one of those things that just isn't done. And I don't really get how neurotypical people are making decisions on behalf of disabled people, but it happens, and that's where things go terribly wrong. Um, and that happens like in the UK. I mean, it kind of happens everywhere. But if you are starting to do a disability project for the first time, it's important to just start it off right. And so consulting a panel of disabled people, hearing what would be helpful, and then working from there. Also trying to reduce stigma from the very beginning. I mean, I was part of a shackling event, and it was basically talking about people with certain mental health problems who get locked up in certain third world countries. And a lot of that was just due to stigma. I mean, there's certain situations where people believe that maybe an autistic person or a person with certain mental health conditions is like possessed by a demon, and as part of that, they need to be locked up. And so, starting with having just some basic education about, mental health conditions, neurodiversity, disability in general, and just rolling that out to begin with. But I think that's advice for any country really, because yes, I mean in the UK there's still some crazy misconceptions. I mean, I'm frequently told that girls can't be autistic. If you make eye contact, you can't be autistic. And so just that's kind of universal advice.
Yeah, so when it came to like QL mentoring, specifically, you talked a little bit about like consulting panels of neurodiverse individuals, but obviously, each individual has a lot of like a variety of different experiences when it comes to neurodiversity. So obviously, you had your own experiences, but did you have friends, family, just other individuals that you consulted beforehand, or how did QL mentoring come to be in that sense?
With QL mentoring, I mean, I would I wrote the article kind of from my perspective. I mean, there are lots of, if there are lots of articles on there that talk about, this is what helped me. I actually have a bullying advice column, and as part of that, I share my experience with bullying. And so I did write it from a very, like, you may have a different experience. This is just some things that helped me. But at the same time, I spent a lot of time on different platforms reading about people's experiences. Um, I was on I went onto Mumsnet pretty frequently, and that was a good place to find different advice because mums would share their experience of, like their child's autism or learning differences, and from that perspective. Because when I started QOL Mentoring, I was 13. And so I wasn't really hearing many stories from my age group. But as I've gotten older and my age group has become more kind of present on online networks, I'm able to find autistic people directly who are talking about their experiences online. And there are themes that come up. And when I wrote my book, A Spectrum Girl Survival Guide, I was reading hundreds of stories of autistic girls, and I was finding them online and going to different platforms to do that. And then kind of sharing the advice that I had from reading all of those stories and advice that had worked well for other people.
Yeah, so you kind of talked about some of your work, specifically about your your survival guide. In your essay "Alienated," you mentioned how there's like an invisible barrier that divides us. Um, what steps do you think the neurodiversity movement needs to take in order to kind of like get rid of this barrier, starting with Neurodiversity Celebration Week and kind of moving forward?
I think it's to start talking about it more. I always say this, but 20% of the population are neurodiverse. Like everybody knows someone who's neurodiverse. Everyone has a family member, is neurodiverse themselves, has a friend. I mean, it's like 1 in 5 people. But yet there are all these misconceptions, all these stigma. There's a crazy lack of resources. And to kind of break that barrier down, people have to start realizing that neurodiversity isn't this very niche thing that you don't encounter. Neurodiversity is everywhere. And if you have an iPhone that was designed by a neurodiverse individual, I mean, many of the tech, like a lot of technology, is designed by neurodiverse people. 60% of entrepreneurs are dyslexic. Just realizing that it's out there and then working to reduce some of that stigma and like all of these misconceptions and ideas that are very, very prevalent and really kind of put a barrier in place. I mean, I've had, especially around autism, a lot of people don't really realize, like, would never categorize me as someone who could be autistic because, I mean, I've been told, how can you be autistic if you're talking? And I was shocked by this because that's not like part of the diagnosis criteria of autism. Like nowhere in the diagnosis criteria does it say to be autistic, you can't talk. I mean, yes, there are some people who are nonverbal, but that's autism spectrum. And so if you have that viewpoint on autism, then it's going to be very difficult for you to kind of interact and have a healthy viewpoint of autistic people. And so reducing some of that stigma and talking about it more.
Yeah. So, do you like obviously you're diagnosed with a variety of different conditions. Do you think those diagnoses are necessary in a world of neurodiversity when we're focused on embracing strengths, or do you think that needs to kind of phase out a little bit and it needs to be changed to like that social model of disability that a lot of different advocates talk about?
Um, I mean, I think that it is important to be diagnosed. There are definitely benefits that come from that. Um, I when I was diagnosed, I mean, in the UK, it's pretty difficult to get. We have the NHS where you can get certain diagnoses for free, and you can be diagnosed with, the conditions I have: ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism for free. But it takes like 2 years. There's a really long waiting list, and my parents had to decide, okay, do we wait or do we pay so that she can be diagnosed? And do we put an importance on a diagnosis? And they decided to do that, and they decided to pay so that we could fast track it. And I think that that was the right decision to do. I will always be happy that I ended up with a diagnosis because it meant that there was no questioning why I was different. And it also meant that you're able to get all these different services. And because once you have, a piece of paper that says this person is dyslexic, you can get extra time and you can get all of those elements. I know that some people say, oh, well, I don't want to have the label. Um, but that's never been my experience because I feel like I've always been dyslexic, always been dyspraxic. Now there's just yes, there is a label, there's a term for it, but that label is incredibly helpful just because of the way society's built. And if you don't have that label, then it's gonna make things more complicated for you services wise.
Yeah, so I've personally seen you speak at the Stanford Neurodiversity Project here, obviously, and even more conferences based on our team's research. The videos that have been all over the internet. But how do you ensure that the local community impact that you've probably built from day one at your personal school that you've kind of created over the years stays there even as you speak across the globe?
Um, I mean, I think that with all the work I do, I never kind of I always continue doing what I started with. So I started off doing my QOL Mentoring website, and I still work on my QOL Mentoring. I started off with my certain, social media accounts, and I've continued to use them. I've never kind of been in a situation where I grew a following and I grew up a base on a certain platform and then kind of moved on to a different platform and forgotten about that group. I've just kind of built and maintained. And I think that that's an important model because people who followed me, when I was 13 years old, they're still able to go on that original network where they found me and hear me talking and hear updates. There was never an element of, oh, okay, I'm going to get this group of people and I'm going to, get them from whatever, like a Twitter account, and then move on to doing something else and just abandon them. So that if they're not growing with me, they're just going to be left behind. I make sure that I keep all of my networks. And it's a tiring process, but I think it's important so that people can still keep in touch and still hear my message because my message has evolved over the years. When I was 13, I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 15. So, from that, after I was diagnosed, I started talking about my ADHD more. And, my message is definitely, I'd say true to its original sentiment, but it has changed. And so I make sure that through all of my platforms that's reflected.
Yeah. So where does QL mentoring go from here? Like your website has a lot of resources and all of these things, but how do you plan on expanding QL mentoring? Do you plan on expanding it at all? Or is it just kind of like adding resources whenever possible?
There's a lot of just adding resources whenever possible. Um, the thing with QL mentoring, and it was kind of weird, is I started it at 13 with this idea of this is going to be for school age children. And it's going to be a guide for surviving school as a dyslexic, dyspraxic, autistic student, or a student with ADHD, because that was something that there weren't resources on. There were resources on how to help your autistic kid, how to help your dyslexic student, but there weren't resources on school age kids in the school system. And now I'm 18 and I'm not in the school system. And so it's difficult to write those same articles from that perspective. Um, and I don't want to change QL mentoring into a how to survive university because I still want there to be resources for that demographic. And so I'm keeping all the articles that I wrote originally on there, but I'm also updating things. And, I do have articles on there that are like myths about autistic girls, I had an article about stealth dyslexia. And so just writing more of those that have that same narrative but aren't maybe like speaking from that same experience. Because I remember, like reading articles that were meant to help kids in the school system and then just being really outdated and then having nothing to do with anything and not talking about the important parts and written from a perspective of someone who went to school 20 years ago. And I don't want to ever be that person. I don't want to ever be putting advice out there like that because I've read those things and they're very unhelpful. Um, so yeah, just kind of growing QL mentoring in that way.
Yeah, I guess we can end off our interview, our segment with this, like, I guess a little bit of a personal question. What does university look like for you? What are you planning on doing in university? Are you planning on researching neurodiversity? How are you going from here, I guess?
Yeah, so I'm applying to university now. I'm applying to Stanford, Harvard, Yale, MIT, Princeton, and then Oxford. And so I've taken my exam for Oxford to study physics there, and I'm hoping to get an interview. I haven't found out yet. But if all goes to plan, I want to study physics. Math and physics are my greatest passions. That's partly due to my autism. I'm very logical, and that applies very well. And so I would want to go to university and study that, and always, bear in mind my experience with my neurodiversity. But in reality, I think that a lot of the advocacy I do is speaking from my experience and from what I've been through. And so having a degree in learning differences, I don't think that would add to my advocacy or improve it in any way, because the reason it's grown to what it is because of the number of learning differences I have. I mean, I have every single one that you can have apart from dyscalculia, which I mean is lucky because math and physics is my thing. But that means that I can write an article about whatever I want. If you want me to write about my experience of dyslexia, ADHD, it's all there. And that's something that I've really accepted, the fact that my advocacy is what it is because of my experience, and the fact that I'm speaking from something that impacts me. And so I would never be interested in getting a degree in neurodiversity. It would all be physics for me.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. That concludes our 15th episode of Neurodiversity in a Nutshell. It was amazing to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us today.